evening, everybody, and welcome to this evening's Research Showcase series hosted by Lancaster University Psychology Department. Tonight we're going to be talking to you about lying across the lifespan. I've got the lovely Dr. Lara Warmelink here to talk to us. So Lara did a talk last year for the lockdown series, and this talk tonight is going to follow on from that. But don't worry if you didn't see it. Lara will do a little bit of a catch up, and if you do want to watch last year's, then please make your way over to the website where there is a link and you can watch last year's if you want after this one. This one will also be put up as well after this, so you'll be able to see both of them. So before we start, just a couple of house points. First of all, the talk will run for about 30 minutes, and then after that there's going to be about half an hour of question and answer session. Hopefully everything will go nice and smoothly this evening, but if it doesn't, if we encounter any technical difficulties, please do bear with us and we will get them sorted as soon as we possibly can. If you have any questions throughout the talk, please do post them to the Q&A box at any point, and I will publish the questions as they come in. If you would also like to know the answer to any of the questions that come in, please do give them a thumbs up so that we know at the end which are the most popular questions, and we can make sure that we prioritize those so that just in case there's not enough time for all of the questions, we can at least answer the ones with the most thumbs up. But hopefully we'll get through them all, we'll see. If you would like subtitles, then go ahead and click the CC button, but please do note that we do not generate these subtitles. We have nothing to do with them. They are generated by Microsoft, so if they're a bit funky, then it's not our fault. So without any further delay, please welcome Dr. Lara Warmelink. Thanks, Lara.
Thank you, Daphne. Thank you. Yeah, I will warn you in advance about the subtitles. The subtitles don't really work that well with my voice. So earlier this year, I gave for students a talk about some Freudian theory, which included, Freudian's famous theory about the id, the ego, and the superego, and the subtitles consistently translated this as IT, ego, and superego. I'm not sure what our IT people get up to, but I hope they're not meeting any superegos in real life. But in this talk, I'm going to be talking about aging and how aging affects our lying behavior, or maybe how aging sort of relates to our lying behavior. So I'm going to start by giving you a little bit of a definition of what I mean when I talk about lying, and talk about, well, how often do people lie in the first place? So as Daphne said, I gave a similar talk to the lockdown seminar series last year, and I also said something about the definition in the prevalence then. So if you remember my talk from last year really well, or you just watched it back on YouTube half an hour ago, this might be a good moment to just quickly get yourself a cup of tea and come back in 5 minutes when I get to the cool new stuff. And the new stuff is really looking at aging and honesty. So whether as we age, we become more honest or maybe less honest. So, in any science, it's important that we know what we're talking about. And there's several definitions of lying in the literature, but I always use this one. This is the definition of lying that's used by Albert Vrij, who was my PhD supervisor. So I'm sort of honor bound to always go by his definition of lying. Or deception. Lying and deception are sort of used interchangeably a little bit in the literature. But the definition of deception or lying that I'm using here is a successful or unsuccessful deliberate attempt without forewarning to create in another a belief which the communicator considers to be untrue. So what's important here is that it's the communicator's belief that matters. It doesn't actually have to be untrue. It's the fact that the communicator believes it to be untrue that makes a difference. So how often do people lie? And the first sort of study in the literature that looks at that was done by Bella De Paulo and her colleagues back in 1996. And they used a self-report study. So they basically asked people, how often do you lie? I hope that you can see the problems with such a methodology. You know, people might lie to you after all in these studies. But at the same time, it's probably a really good place to start. If we want to know how often people lie, let's ask them. And De Paulo and her colleagues find that on average, students lied about twice a day. And the non-student adults in their sample lied about once a day. So they're clearly seeing this sort of distinction between the students and the non-students. And that might, of course, partly be age, because students are on average quite young compared to non-student adults. The other thing that the liars in this study sort of emphasize is they're saying that their lies aren't serious. These are not people going around trying to con old ladies out of their life savings. You know, these are little lies, polite lies, white lies, simple stuff. And De Paulo and her colleagues in a slightly different publication, but I won't bore you with those kind of details, but from the same study in 1996, also looked at, well, to who are people lying? And in general, they're finding that both students and non-students are lying more to people who they know less well. So people report that they're not lying a lot to their spouses or their children. So in less than 10% of the conversations with their spouses or their children are they reporting that they're lying. So people are like sort of keeping a diary in this study of how often they lie. So they're not being asked to sort of think about it in hindsight, like trying to write down all their lies as they tell them. Well, maybe not literally as they tell them, but, you know, within minutes. And they're lying much more often to strangers. So in over half of their conversations with strangers, people are reporting that they told at least one lie. And their friends are sort of in between, you know, their spouses and their strangers. The real exception to this sort of rule of the less well you know someone, the more you lie is moms. People report lying quite a lot to their moms, or in quite a lot of the conversations with their mom, are they telling at least one lie. So mothers seem to be the sort of the odd relationship out in this general trend of the more I know you, the more truthful I'm going to be. And then in 2010, Sirota, Levine and Boster did a very similar study. So they're asking people how often they're lying. And in this case, they're asking them in the last 24 hours, so in the last day, how often did you lie? And they're finding averages that are quite similar to what De Paulo was finding 15 years before. So their average is quite close to that one lie a day that we saw previously. But they also note that that average is really hiding a lot of variation. So they're finding that 60% of the people in their samples say that they didn't tell any lies at all in the last 24 hours. And 5.3% of their participants told half of the lies in the whole study. And the top 1% of liars told almost a quarter of all the lies. So there's a real variance, this real odd distribution of lying. Or maybe we could say that lies are distributed a little bit like money. Lots of people are poor, few people have all the money. It's a little bit like that with lies. Lots of people are honest, and there's a couple of people who lie a lot. So then I wanted to talk about how age affects this. So how age affects how often people lie. And this graph comes from a study by Debye and her colleagues. But I made the graph myself. I'm sure that if Debye made this graph, it'd be much better looking. I sort of just knocked this up from the data in their paper. But they asked participants, they actually stood in the Science Museum in Amsterdam and asked everybody who came in, how often did you lie in the last 24 hours? And what you see in this graph on the x-axis, you see their age. So the sort of leftmost bar is for children aged 6 to 8. And then we get the 9 to 12-year-olds, the 13 to 17-year-olds, the 18 to 30-year-olds, 30 to 44, 45 to 59, and 60 plus. The oldest person in the study was 77. And you see this sort of really nice U-shaped curve. So the 9 to 12-year-olds lie more often than the 6 to 8-year-olds, and the 13 to 17-year-olds lie more often than the 9 to 12-year-olds. And there's people, particularly Victoria Talber, who've devoted a lot of their research life into looking at children's lying. And I think it is fair to conclude that the reason that children start lying more as they age is that they get better at it. 6 to 8-year-olds, they can lie, but they're getting caught a lot. They're not really smart about it. They get in trouble sometimes, not a good idea. But even though they're reporting that they're lying, on average about, 1.5, obviously you can't tell 1.5 lies, but somewhere between 1 and 2 lies. So, they're lying regularly. But, as they're getting older, getting better, getting more friends, more people to know, more people to lie to, they start lying more. And I think that's a pattern that we as psychologists sort of feel comfortable, we sort of understand. We know why this lying behavior is increasing. But then you see that quite sharply from the 13 to 17-year-old to the 18-year-old is, a relatively steep drop, where they go back to lying, almost 3 times a day to less than twice a day. Still, quite a lot, but, there's a substantial drop there. And then lying seems to be sort of steady throughout the sort of 18, 29, 30, 45, and you might see sort of gentle decline with the 60 to 77-year-olds. And we don't really understand this decline. So you see the same decline in Sirota studies, so that older people are reporting lying less than younger adults, but we don't really know why. And I think this graph gives us sort of 2 hypotheses. First of all, this sort of sharp drop between the 13 to 17-year-olds and the 18 to 29-year-olds suggests that there might be a sort of break at 18. Something happens at 18 which is changing people's honesty. And then you start thinking, well, what changes for people at the age of 18? Well, there's a lot of extra independence at the age of 18. People leave school and maybe go to university. People might move out of their parents' house. And that might be driving this increase in honesty. In a certain way, if you imagine the life of a 15-year-old versus the life of a 20-year-old, a 15-year-old might be much more often in a situation where lying might be beneficial. I mean, they might be engaging more with their mothers, and we've already seen that people lie more to their mothers than to other people in their lives. They might be in school where lying might be beneficial. Teenagers live with a kind of authority that young people in their 20s don't necessarily have. Maybe I can give an example. If I'm 15, my mother might ask me, did you do your homework? And if I didn't do my homework, it might be in my best interest to lie and say that I did it anyway. When I'm 20, my mother might not even ask me if I do my homework. And if she did, I might say, well, I haven't done it yet, but that's okay because I'm a grown-up now and I can decide when I do my homework. So there's sort of a different situation that teenagers live in. The other hypothesis that you might create from this picture, especially the sort of slow decline in lying between sort of the 30 to 45-year-olds and the 60+ people, is that as people age, people might start having memory problems, people might lose some of that speed in thinking, and that might make lying more difficult or more dangerous for them. So that, older people might think, well, there's a saying in some languages that if you lie a lot, you have to have a good memory because you have to remember who you told what and you have to keep track of that. And maybe as people age, that calculation of I could lie to these people, but I'd have to remember it and have to keep track of it. You know what, I'm just going to tell them the truth instead. And that sort of calculation might sort of flip more and more into honesty the older you get, partly because people are perhaps, not as cognitively speedy as they used to be. There is also a third hypothesis, which has been advanced to me by many older adults when I sort of represent these, when I show them this graph and I talk about this. A lot of older adults say it's just because they were raised proper and young people these days weren't. But I'll leave that hypothesis to the side for now. Because what I want to talk to you about in this talk is I want to talk to you about a little bit of research that I did before the pandemic, in which I was looking at, well, why do older people lie less? And I thought what I would do, I would ask them, because that's, I think, a good way to study why people do what they do. But what I also did is I asked people, first of all, I asked people, well, how often do you lie in the last 24 hours, much like Paulo did and much like Sirota did. and thereby did. But I also asked them, if you were in this particular situation, would you lie? And my thinking was that if it is the case that older people lie less because they are less often in a situation where lying is beneficial to them, then if you ask them, would you lie in this situation, they would say that they would lie about equally often. So then what you would see is that if you ask people, how often do you lie? Older people lie less. But if you ask them, in this situation, would you lie? They would lie about equally often. And if we found that pattern, we would know that older people lie less because of the situations they're in. Well, if we found that older people also lied less in the same situations, well, then we would know it's probably actually to do with older people's honesty and not just with the situations they happen to find themselves in. So I'm just going to show you the results from this study. The first thing I looked at when I got the results is I looked at whether people were consistent in saying how often they lied in the different way we asked them. So we asked them, how often did you lie in the last 24 hours? In these situations, so I call these scenarios, in these scenarios would you lie? And then also we asked in general, how often do you lie? Are you like above average liar? And the data that's in this table are correlations. And for those of you who aren't familiar with correlations, correlations indicate how closely linked data is. And that's sort of rated between -1, 0, and 1. So 1 means this data is exactly the same. 0 means there's no relationship between the two things you're measuring at all. And -1 means the data in one variable is the complete opposite of the data in the other variable. So we're seeing here that the how often do you lie question correlates reasonably well with both the how often did you lie in the last 24 hours scenario and the lies in response to these scenarios that we gave them. So I would have liked these correlations to be a little bit higher, but you know, overall, I think they're good enough to suggest that people are at least attempting to answer the questions properly. You know, there's some consistency between these different questions, because ideally, of course, I would have liked them to be quite closely correlated. That if people say that I lie a lot, they should also say that they lied a lot in the last 24 hours, and they should also be willing to lie in a lot of the scenarios. So yeah, I'll live with these numbers. So this is a graph, and don't worry, I'm going to talk you all through the graph for those of you who aren't psychologists and aren't used to this, but this is just a simple scatter plot where on the x-axis we have age. So on the left-hand side, you see the 16-year-olds. The people had to be at least 16 to take part, so there's quite a sort of sharp drop-off at 16, all the way to, I think 92 is the oldest person in the study. And then on the y-axis, you see how often they said they lied in the last 24 hours. And this was asked to them in a sort of grid question. So they were like, how often in the last 24 hours did you lie to your parents? How often in the last 24 hours did you lie to your friends? So if somebody says that they lied, I don't know, 20 times, it could be that they lied a lot to their parents, but not at all to their friends, or a lot to their friends, but not at all to their parents. So there was a sort of, this is like a sum score for all of the times they lied. And then you see that there's a line projected to the graph, and this is actually looking at the effect of aging. So you can see that that line's going down from the left-hand side, which represents the young people, to the right-hand side, which represents the older people. And you can see that that line's going down, and that means that older people are lying less, or that older people are more honest. And if you look at the actual data, you can see that that sort of height, the fact that younger people are lying more, is being driven by sort of group of people who are like between 16 and 22, who are lying quite a lot, sort of lying between sort of 8 and 20 times. And they're sort of pulling up the average for the young people. And you can also see that there's a bunch of people who are maybe outliers. There's a group of about 3 people who are lying really a lot. So if you think back to what Sirota said, there's lots of people who are lying very little, and there's a couple of people who are lying a lot. And you're seeing in this data set that most of the people who are lying a lot are quite young. So there's 2 people who are below 20 who say that they're lying more than 30 times in the last 24 hours. And then 1 person who's about 40 who said that they lied about 30. So again, this sort of young outliers, these young people who are lying a lot, are pulling up the average for the younger people. There is also one lady who is over 80 and really lying a lot. I looked her up. It is a lady. She's 86. And I don't know why, because I didn't ask, you know, who did you lie to or why did you lie? I don't know whether this was like a special day for her where she lied to a lot of people, or, you know, whether she just walks around and lies to people all the time. But I like her. I think she is a lovely sort of data point in this plot. So what happened with the scenarios? First of all, let me just show you all of the scenarios. So there were 9 of them, and you see them here listed by how often people lied to them. So the scenario that people were most honest in, or were most likely to say, well, I'm not going to lie here, is in a scenario where people were asked to imagine that they had borrowed something special from a friend, and then they'd broken it. And then they had the opportunity to lie and pretend that somebody else had broken it. And then we asked, well, would you blame this other person or would you admit that it was you? And almost 90% of the people in the study said, no, I would admit it was me. I'm not going to lie about this. And then you get sort of more 50-50 scenarios. So if you were in class or at work, we varied the exact phrasing of the scenarios depending on whether the people who were like filling them in were either A-level students or university students or adults. So basically, if they were adults, it would say, well, if you were at work, blah, blah. If and for students, it would say if you were in school or if you were at uni. So we had these scenarios where like, well, you go into a meeting, you're supposed to have done some reading, but you didn't do it. Would you lie to hide that? And then you're like getting, oh, 60% of people are lying to that. If you were in a psychology experiment and an experimenter assistant made a mistake and that assistant asked you to lie to the experimenter to hide the mistake, would you lie? Quite a lot of people are willing to do that. And then it goes all the way to a psychology experiment. Basically, let's say you were a participant in a psychology experiment and we would want you to lie as part of the experiment. Would you do that? And then like 90% of people are like, yeah, no, I totally lie about that. So we have this sort of quite a wide range of scenarios that differ a lot on whether people are willing to be honest or told the truth about them. And we did that on purpose. I wanted to have a series of scenarios that really differed quite a lot in people's willingness to lie. Actually, personally, I think that 90% on the psychology experiment is actually a little bit low. I mean, I am a psychologist. I've done this for a very long time. It is very uncommon for people to take part in one of my experiments and then to say, oh, I don't want to lie. But maybe the people who wouldn't want to lie never sign up for my experiments. So maybe my own experience there is a little bit flawed. But then what we did is we looked at whether people's age affected whether they'd be willing to lie in this scenario. So the scenarios here are sorted in the order of the effect of age. So we see that the only scenario where older adults say that they're more willing to lie, or older adults are more willing to lie, more likely to say that they would lie than younger adults, is the scenario that was also the most lied to scenario, which is if you took part in psychology experiments and you were asked to lie for that experiment, would you do that? Like I said, most people are willing to do that, and older adults are more willing to do that than younger adults. But then you see for all of the other scenarios, older adults are less likely to lie than younger adults, although like for the restaurant scenario, the effect's really small. This scenario was, you've gone with a large group of people to a restaurant and you've all had to pre-order. So you're all just saying in advance, this is what I want to eat. But then when you're at the restaurant, food that somebody else has pre-ordered comes out, but you really like to look at it. Would you lie and say that that's what you ordered? So they gave you that person's food and then the other person gets stuck without it. So that's pretty flat. Younger people, that was quite an honest scenario. Most people said they wouldn't lie that way, and it doesn't really matter much. But then when you get into the sort of the bigger scenarios, the effect becomes much larger. So the biggest effects where older adults are really saying that they're less likely to lie than younger adults are restaurant cold food. So this is, you're in a restaurant and the food's been brought out and it's cold and you don't like it. And then the server asks, is everything okay? The way waitresses do. Would you then lie and say that everything's okay? And older adults are like, you know, they're much less likely to lie there. So older adults are probably just sitting there going, no, the food's cold, I want new food. Well, sort of our students are much more likely, oh, I don't know, I might lie and say that everything was okay. And the other scenario is a lie to cover for a friend's absence. So there's a friend who you work with or who you go to school with, depending on how old you are. And they're not there that day and you know where they are and they've asked you to cover for them. Would you lie to your boss or your teacher to sort of cover for them? And again, older adults are like, nope, I'm totally telling my boss about my friend. So there's honesty there. But like older adults are more honest there, but not necessarily kinder, if you know what I mean. It's the honesty that they're going for. So then we wanted to know, well, why do older adults lie less? So whenever somebody in response to a scenario said, yes, in this situation, I would lie, we asked them how they would feel if they lied. So we asked them, well, would you feel guilty if you lied in that scenario? And you see that across all the scenarios in which people said, yes, I would lie, that older people say that they would feel more guilty. So here you see a similar graph to the one that you saw earlier. On the x-axis, you see age with the youngest people on the left, oldest people on the right. And then on the y-axis, you see the scale of rating. So we asked people to rate how guilty they'd feel on a scale of 1 to 7, with 7 being I'd feel really guilty and 1 being I don't feel guilty at all. And the y-axis is truncated here, which is annoying, but that's the way the picture came out. So you're seeing that the 20-year-olds, if they lie, rate themselves about a 2, so they're not really feeling guilty at all. And the sort of the 90-year-olds are sitting, well, there's not that many 90-year-olds. Obviously, this is a projection, but you know, people are going up to about 3 and a little bit. So the effect's not massive, but it's still like it's a point on a 7-point scale. So it's, you know, it's measurable, even if it isn't very large. And then we also asked them, how difficult would you find it to lie? If you were in this scenario and you had to tell this lie, would it be difficult? And when we said difficult, we meant in a sort of cognitive way, like would it be difficult to think of something convincing? Not would it be emotionally difficult? But again, we see that the older adults rate this lie as more difficult. This was also measured on a 1 to 7 scale. And in this case, it's sort of going down from a little on a 2.5 to about 3.5. So again, the effect's about 1 point on a 7-point scale. Again, not massive, but measurable. So older adults are saying that they find lying more guilt-inducing and more difficult, which might also be the reason that they're lying less often. If you're finding lying difficult and you're finding that lying makes you feel guilty, then maybe you're like, well, I'm just not going to lie. I'll just tell them the truth. So I don't have to feel guilty or I don't have to experience this difficult task. So in conclusion, I'm very proud of myself on the timing. Older adults report being more honest, like we also saw in the previous research in the literature. But this seems to be not just because they live different lives. It's not just that older adults, you know, are less likely to have parents or, you know, what seems to be going on is that older adults have moral and maybe cognitive reasons to be more honest. So it's not just that they happen to be lucky or they happen to live sort of more in an honest bubble. They are more honest themselves. And that's a good thing. But that also means that we have more questions about why they are more honest. So where are these sort of guilty feelings coming from? Where is this sort of morality coming from? So we got back to what the older adults told me in the first place. Maybe they were just raised differently. Maybe they're just more honest people at heart. Thank you very much for listening. Oh yeah, there is another slide I was asked to show you about next week. Sorry, I can't see the question comes in yet. So I'll advertise Leslie's talk for next week, and then I'll take questions. Thank you very much.
Sorry, I forgot to turn the mic back on. I was talking away there. Thanks, Lara. It was a really interesting talk, and it follows on perfectly from last time. It's really interesting. We've got a question here. Is there any objective way to measure lying without asking people directly? Maybe older people simply forget about the lies they tell.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. And the thing is, because I use Vrij's definition, which says that lying is when you tell people something which you believe to be untrue, it's almost impossible to do so objectively, because you might be able to state objectively, well, this person said something that isn't true, but if they believed it to be true, they aren't lying. So you always have that subjective element that sits inside the lie. And because of that, because you need that subjective element, because you need to go, well, did you believe that? You're basically automatically getting to the point where you might as well ask them whether they lied. Because people are wrong all the time as well. And people can't, like when people are wrong, often they don't know they're wrong, because if they knew they were wrong, they wouldn't say something that was wrong. So then you'd have to sort of go after them and say, you said this and this was wrong. And then they can go, wait a second, was it wrong? No, that wasn't wrong. Yeah, that was wrong. And that sort of also really distorts their memory. So on one hand, yes, it's quite possible that older people are lying, but they're not remembering this in the same way. It's also possible that older people just use a different definition of what lying means. So that's where younger people would say, oh, that's definitely a lie. Older people are like, no, that's fine. That doesn't count as a lie. So that might be affecting it as well. So yeah, it does happen. But because we use the subjective definition, we're more or less forced to go off the liar's opinion of it. And the other thing is, if older people were forgetting about their own lies, you would expect them to respond quite similarly to the scenarios, because in the scenarios, they were specifically asked, would you lie? Like, would you lie and say this? So like they couldn't, like in the scenarios, they can't be wrong because they have to give this yes, no answer in response to this question. And that question explicitly asks them to lie. And there we see older adults, you know, choose the honest response more often, even when that's not the more friendly response. So I do think there's probably actually some actual honesty in older adults, independently of whether they're forgetting or having different definitions. They might also be forgetting, but I think there is some actual honesty there, which really surprised me. My hypothesis for this study was that older adults would be quite similar to younger adults on the scenarios, but the effect's much bigger than I thought it was.
So actually gets really quite philosophical then, really, doesn't it, when you're talking about all of this stuff?
It does. It's quite a philosophical thing, because and if you want to go really philosophical, you come back to the question, is there actually a truth? You know, is this like, you know, the X-Files, the truth is out there? And I think a lot of people who work in lie detection don't believe so. It's like the longer you work with sort of these kinds of social relationships and lies, the more you start, you know, the truth is what you perceive it to be. And if your truth is different than my truth because you perceive things differently than me, then is it really meaningful to say that you lied? Well, sometimes it's meaningful to say that you lied, but then that's a perception of the people who are telling the lie, of people who are hearing the lie. That isn't necessarily something that would make sense for an outsider.
Yeah, it does get really in depth. It's really interesting thing to study. We've got the questions are really pouring in now. Somebody wants to know, anonymous, did the older participants state why they thought younger generations lie more due to the difference in upbringing?
Yeah, so I didn't ask this directly in this study. So this is something that's basically sometimes I give talk to, for example, the University of the Third Age, and quite often sort of I speak to people. And also before I did this study, because I was already thinking about sort of what Debai had said and what Sarod had said about aging, and I was like more or less just talking to all the people about, you know, what do you think? And they tend to just see this as And I don't know, maybe I'm being a little bit short, like I'm summarizing their opinion in a way that's a little bit rude to them. But a lot of older people seem to just see themselves as more moral, like more morally upstanding people, and they see honesty as part of that. So sort of the idea that younger people lie more often seems to them to be part of this more general moral degeneration in the younger generation. You know, they're like going out and having funny haircuts and, you know, drinking and stuff like that. And that lying is sort of part of this general misbehavior that to them young people seem to be engaging in all the time. I'm not sure this is actually a compliment to themselves, because after all, they raised these young people. Because often older adults say this on their parents. They often talk about their upbringing and, you know, the way their parents instilled the value of honesty in them. And younger people these days don't have that, they will say. Mickey, but didn't you raise these younger people? But yeah.
That's a really good point.
Yeah, I've never asked them that to their face, because that sounds to me like really, but didn't you, you know, are your kids better than other people's kids? But they may well be pointing out to a sort of more general cultural effect that perhaps, you know, for example, the rise of social media might have made honesty less important. Like maybe it really is the case that when, you know, the older people who are 60 plus, you know, maybe, you know, 50 years ago when they were children, honesty was more important because maybe they had like a smaller community around them, so that if they lied, people would quite quickly find out. And, you know, these days, A-level students, university students, you know, they're living a lot of their lives on the internet, which allows them to, you know, even if they don't entirely lie, it might be allowing them to sort of choose what they are sharing and what they're not sharing, and manipulate that in a way that, you know, is dishonest or borders on dishonesty. And that might have just changed the sort of cultural idea of how important honesty is. So, you know, I'm assuming that's their reasoning is a little bit, well, that's just because everything was better 50 years ago, when really they're probably partly addressing cultural changes that are really important.
Thank you. Yeah, there's a question here that I was actually thinking all the way through as well. So this person's along the same lines as I was wondering. So, and again, anonymous, this person says, could self-esteem explain some of the young people's lying behavior to save face if older people have higher self-esteem? So is it like a confidence thing that older people are more kind of comfortable in their own skin, in their own bodies, and they don't feel the need to lie as much as the younger people? And I was also wondering, sorry, if I can just add something on to the end of that. Sorry, I wrote it down. Because people understand more about the consequences of lies, and that actually they're not as bad. They realize, you know, through the process of experience, that actually the consequences of lying aren't as bad as what you think they will be a lot of the time. Sorry, that's a lot of question there, isn't it?
Yeah. In a certain way, it's a slightly contradictory question. So to go to the point of self-esteem, yes. I think, for example, both the fact that older adults are saying that they are more willing to lie in an experimental situation where lying is clearly sanctioned, and the fact that they're like less likely to lie in situations where the truth is more confrontational, like, yes, I don't like this food, I want you to bring me new food. I think that this is partly a self-esteem, and perhaps even a little bit of, I don't care so much for my friend. You know, when you get to like the situation, like, would you lie to cover for a friend at work or at school? So that there's a little bit of what's best for me, and let's not give in to sort of social pressure of other people around. So I do think that this matters. And I also think that there might be sort of carryover effects, that as you age, you might become more comfortable in your own skin, which might makes you feel like, oh, you know, I don't have to lie about this, or I don't have to lie to these people, you know, I don't have to make this sort of more cheery presentation of myself to all of these people. And that because you become more honest in that way, that sort of bleeds into other situations where you just sort of get used to saying, I know that telling the truth here would be a little bit confrontational, but I'm going to do it anyway. I think that does play a role as more, you could call it self-esteem, or yeah. I think self-esteem might be a good way forward. I think there might also be a little bit of a case where people might have bad experiences lying at some point during time, and that people become more honest because the last time they lied it got really fuzzy, or because it became really difficult, so that over time people just go, it's not worth it. Let's just tell people the truth. And then the second part of the question was almost like a mirror image of that. Like, if people get used to lying and not getting caught, would that sort of encourage them to tell more lies because they're like, oh, it'll be okay? I imagine it would. And I do wonder whether some of the people who lie a lot do so because they get away with it. Like, they're like, okay, I've gotten away with it, it'll be fine. Like, I'll just lie again next time. So both things might be true. It might just be the case that the self-esteem, honesty effect is bigger than the I've gotten away with lying before, I'll do it again effect.
I think I was trying to get to something different with the consequences, that people realise that the consequences of telling the truth aren't as bad as they think they would be when they were younger. Through experience, they realise that actually telling the truth, you don't get bad consequences as you would expect. So it's kind of the inverse of that. Yeah. I see what you mean. Sorry, I just misunderstood from the way you originally. Yeah, probably. There might also just be a general sort of social power effect there. So if I'm sort of above you in the hierarchy, then I don't necessarily have to lie to you, because I can tell you the truth, even if it's rude, because you can't really do anything back to me because I'm more powerful than you. So lying can be associated with people trying not to hurt other people, trying to ingratiate themselves with other people. And because people often sort of gain social power as they age, because adults have a sort of natural power over children, and people like develop careers, so they tend to sort of get higher socioeconomic status as they age. So that people might just sort of, like, well, I'm at a point in my life where I can just tell you the truth, even if you don't like it. So especially, for example, that restaurant scenario, like, would you write to a waitress? I think social power comes into that, where maybe if you're 16 and you haven't been to a lot of restaurants, you sort of feel that you're not in a position to tell this waitress things are not okay, I want to be changed. Well, if you're, 60 and, you're a retired colonel in the army or whatever you are, or a retired professor, you can be like, no, this isn't good enough, I want you to do it differently. So I think there's a power element to it as well, and that may or may not be correlated with the self-esteem element, because I imagine that as people age, they gain self-esteem, not just because they're aging, but also because they're gaining social power, either through their career or through their children, or through the fact that we tell people that they have to respect their elders. So there's quite a sort of complex relationship there, where probably all of these things matter a little bit. Must be really difficult to disentangle all of these and kind of see which ones are kind of contribute more than any of the others. It must be a really, really difficult thing to do.
Yeah. And then some of these things I haven't even tried testing. So like this idea of power and self-esteem, I think it's actually a really interesting point, but I haven't even asked them about it. I started with guilt. And then you think, well, if people are feeling more self-esteem, would they not also feel less guilty when they do lie, but they feel more guilty? So clearly, it's not all that. It's just a lot we don't know yet.
Yeah. Well, I'll get through to the next question because we've still got a couple more. One person is asking, if you had children to raise, would you, based on your experiences, want to teach them to lie?
Yes, I would very much. And I think almost all people actually teach their children to lie. They just don't call it lying to their kids. They say to their kids, you have to say thank you now, or you have to say this, or it is rude to tell the truth in this situation. So people train their kids, not just by telling them to lie, but also, you know, by punishing them, like, who broke this vase? I did. You're grounded. Wait a second. Now you've just told that kid, if I lie convincingly next time, I'll get away with it. And there is actually research that shows that children who are raised more strictly, so like raised with stricter punishments, lie more convincingly at an earlier age than children who have like less lenient guardians. So both directly by telling children you have to say this now, and indirectly by punishing kids for telling the truth, people are training their kids to lie. And I think that that is actually really important. Being able to lie convincingly is, I think, a very important social skill. So people who are like terrible liars all the time are often quite awkward and quite noticeable. So I hope she doesn't mind me sharing. I won't give you any information about this, but I once spoke to someone who suffered from autism spectrum disorder, and she could speak well. She'd been to extensive training as a child. She was highly intelligent, but she'd never quite picked up the ability to lie convincingly. Like, people always noticed straight away if she tried to lie, and she found that really frustrating. She like actively like, and the reason she contacted me, she's like, do you have any tips on how I can lie better? Because it was really painful. Like, people would invite her somewhere and then she wouldn't want to go because she was like, you know, she didn't particularly like them. But then she couldn't like decline the invitation in a way that was both polite and not lie. So she tried to be like, oh, I'm really sorry, I can't make it. But they'd notice straight away that she was lying, and then they'd be insulted because, you know, she wouldn't. So I think it's really important that not so much that you lie a lot, but that you're able to do so fluently and quickly in normal social situations, because it allows you to do things like apologize, avoid annoying situations, get away from people when you have to without giving offense. I think those are really important skills. And whether you teach your child that by denying that's lying, which most parents do, most parents try to teach a child how to do that without saying you have to lie now, or whether you just explicitly label that lying, which is the more honest way of doing it. I'm not sure whether that matters that much, but yeah, I think it's important that parents teach their children to lie. And as a sort of flip side to that, it's important that parents teach their children when lying is a good idea and when telling the truth is the better option, even if it's right now in the moment you tell it, the more difficult option.
So I suppose parents can at least be assured, based on your data, that yes, you can teach your children to lie and they will lie when they're younger, but don't worry, because as they get older, they will lie less anyway. So this is what our data show. Then there's my favourite. No, darling, today you're 5. No, but mummy, I turned 6 2 months ago. No, because 5-year-olds are cheaper. So today you're 5.
Exactly. Those kinds of things. Or for example, I mean, my personal favourite, I have siblings, half siblings who are a lot younger than me. And my sister was, I think, 3 or something. And we'd gone out and we'd bought a birthday present for my father. And we'd hidden it in the house and it was a surprise. So I told her, we're not going to tell Daddy about the present. It's a surprise, so he can have it on his birthday. Don't tell Daddy about the present. And she was like, she could see it was a surprise. It was fun. It would work. And then my father comes home and he's like, you know, hello, how are you? What did you do today? And she replies, we did not go and buy you a present. Which was, of course, exactly what I told her she had to say. But at the same time, sort of completely blew it up, because my father, of course, instantly realized that we had gone out and bought him a present. So your children are going to lie, so you might as well help them do so successfully rather than doing so in a really unsuccessful way, even though the way my sister failed was quite cute.
Absolutely. So we've got a couple more. Somebody says, could it be that older adults sign up to a lying study to make a point that being honest is important, whereas younger adults sign up to prove that they are good liars?
Maybe. I do think that a lot of older people pride themselves on their honesty in a way that I've rarely seen a younger person do. Like if you think about, what do students say about themselves, they rarely lead with being sort of honest. So it may be, but again, I don't know whether this is because people start valuing honesty more as they age, or whether this is some sort of cohort effect, that honesty was really important when current older adults were growing up and now has become less important. And sign-up effects to the study, I really don't know. The interesting thing is that the A-level students who took part in this, I don't want to say they didn't have a choice, because they, in a certain way, they did have a choice. But basically, we went into an A-level college and we basically asked everybody who was studying A-level psychology to take part. So that might be a sort of more random selection than the way we recruited the students and the older adults, because we basically then went to participant databases. This is a study about lying. Do you want to take part? So it might be that sort of the sort of 2019 to sort of 20 group, they were selected in a slightly different way than the older adults and the 16 to 17-year-olds. So it may well play a role, but I don't know how big that role is.
Like a lot of the things, yeah. Thanks, Lara. There's one more actually, and unless any more come in, we're going to finish on an absolute stonker. I like this one. Somebody's asking, how can you get better at lying?
Practice. Practice, practice, practice. Lying is a skill. It's a social skill like any other. And people often don't talk about social skills as though they're skills. They're like, oh, she's so sweet, or she's so, she's so chatty. And they sort of seem to talk about these things as though they're like internal to someone. But a lot of these things are just thought. Not so much thought, but you can get better at it just by attempting to get better at it. You can become more sociable by saying, oh, actually, I'm going to talk to these people more, or I'm going to go out more. And I would say that it's the same for lying. So if you want to get better at it, do it more often, because a lot of it is also confidence. So often when people give themselves away when they lie, it's because they get really nervous. And if you do it more often, you'll get less nervous, and then it'll be, you'll become more natural at it. So yeah, practice. Just do it more often. There's a beautiful quote by Mark Twain about lying, where he says, "The young ought to be temperate in the use of this great art, until time and time alone can make their practice perfect. Patience, diligence, and attention to detail. On these the student should rely if he ever wants to master this great art." So I will quote his words, if I remember them rightly, about how to do it. Practice, patience, and attention to detail.
You forgot memory. You were saying earlier that it's very important that you have a good memory in order to be able to lie.
Yes. Yes, because you have to remember those things and then people. But the other thing is, like, if you like, okay, you have to be consistent. It has to be about memory. But if you lie a lot, you'll get away with a lot of brazen stuff. You'll get a lot, but a lot of it wasn't me. So if you tell a lie and then like 2 weeks later you tell someone else, and then somebody goes, oh, you said something else 2 weeks ago. You're like, really? I don't think so. I think you must be remembering that wrong. You can get away with a lot. You can get away with more than what you think you do. I hope the audience doesn't start to like try this out massively and fail, and then they all start yelling at me like, I told my husband and he found out straight away. Oh yeah, and don't leave any evidence. So if you tell a lie, think about what could actually be proven. Like, if there's like video evidence, it doesn't matter how much you lie. So yeah, it's good to sort of think about your lying, what could actually be proven. So maybe start lying about things you're going to do in the future, because then, if something happens, oh yeah, something came up and that changed my mind. It's harder to lie about things where, the other person actually has expertise.
Yes, so careful when you're lying to and what about. That's great. I've got one here. It's not it's an anonymous one again, but I can't publish it. It's just somebody saying, are people all practicing lying to their mothers? I suppose it's a good place to start.
Yeah, maybe this is just a form of practice. I just think it's because mums have a form of authority over us where, you know, you can't just tell your mum things sometimes, and then a lie is the obvious way out, in a way where, you know, in a similar situation, you might just tell a spouse or a child the truth when you can't really tell the truth to your mum. Like they have this sort of strange combination of closeness and authority that just might make lying the most efficient way to handle them, where you might have the truth with people who are either similarly close or in similar authority, but not both the closeness and the authority.
That's fantastic. It was a really, really interesting talk and some super discussion at the end. So thank you very much, Lara. That was oh, sorry, I'm just sending this. Yeah, that was really, really enjoyable, and there were some great questions there. So thanks to everyone who attended, and thanks to everyone who asked a question. I hope they were all answered well, that you're happy with the answers. Next week we have Dr. Leslie Hallam. He is going to talk about legal, decent, honest, and truthful. So it kind of similar today, but he's sorry.
We're sticking to a theme here.
Sticking to a theme, but Leslie's going off in a slightly different way. He's talking about advertising. So I think he's got the 5 key steps for this kind of advertising lies. So he's going to talk about how the limit society places on our advertising subvert our rational choices, mirror and amplify our prejudices. So yeah, if you want to learn about how you are being deceived by the whole world and their mothers, then please tune in next week, and I look forward to seeing you all there. Take care.